Very nice.
Right.
Okay, good. All right, so we're gonna kick it off. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Between Two Coaches. We're on a mission to make fitness more human. Our snark is sold separately, and we'll try to keep the snark to a minimum tonight. I'm Coach Amanda. Not to a minimum. I'm Coach Amanda, and I'm joined as always with my co-host,
Coach Nick. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. We have a very special episode. We have a special guest today. It is Dr. Stacy Sims. Welcome for joining us, Dr. Stacy.
Oh, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to chatting.
Dr.
Yeah.
Sims. If you wouldn't mind, for those of the listeners who are living under a large rock, would you mind just sharing briefly who you are and what you do?
So I am a female athlete performance physiologist. That's a big, long words, but basically I've taken all of my sporting and academic career to look at women in research, in the lab, but also in the field, and really explore physiological differences in training and nutrition.
Sounds like you do a lot for a lot of us.
That's a very shortened version. I could expand it, and then we would be on the podcast explaining all the things I do, from being a mom to being a wife to being business owner to working with teams and individuals and trying to empower women and empower their coaches and all of the things. But I think we'll probably get into that.
Well,
here.
and to you mastering your recovery between all the time zones that you operate in person and virtually.
Figure that being in a constant state of tired is the norm, which isn't a good way to be, but I figure with all the time zones and everything, I'll just take that.
Well, time from what I've gathered, time is fake, so it is what it is.
That's true.
And we're gonna dive right in to some of the topic areas that our listeners are most interested in, as well as just the areas that you've explored in your research. Fitness.
So I'll frame it up a little bit first. When we're talking about the way that a female body ages, we have puberty and we have all the different changes that happen there. We can have our reproductive years with a pregnancy thrown in, have lots of crazy hormone fluxes there. And then people think that women just age in this linear fashion, just like men. So when you see all the aging data, it's more of a linear aging with a bit of testosterone drop. And that's primarily how we think of aging. But when we actually dig down into it and we see perimenopause, what it is kind of like the reverse of puberty. So with puberty, your body's trying to become robust enough to actually be reproducibly capable. And so when we get to the other end of the things, this is when our ovarian function starts to wind down. It's a natural part of aging. So what we're finding is women are having more and more anovulatory cycles because they're not producing robust eggs. So if we don't have an ovulatory cycle, we don't produce progesterone. So effectively what's happening in perimenopause is we're having a change in the ratios of our estrogen and our progesterone in early days. And we know that changes in body comp and mood and attention to training and training responses can happen 7 years before the first overt symptomology of perimenopause occurs. So most people think perimenopause is disruption of sleep, hot flashes, mood changes, heavy periods, iron deficiency, all of these things that we hear about menopausal symptoms. But in actuality, there's a lot of women who are in their late 30s who are starting to go, what's going on? My training isn't working for me. I have this deadened fatigue. I'm not recovering properly. And it has to do with our hormones and the ratios of those hormones, because they're not just sex hormones. They affect every system of the body. We think about metabolism, body comp, body fat, inflammation, antioxidative responses, mood. See, even our neurotransmitters are affected. So every bit of our body is affected by these changing in these hormones. When we get smack dab in the middle of perimenopause, we really start to see these overt miscommunications for women who are active of how they're training and how they're fueling their body and what they expect their body to do. So when we're talking about this, because we're having these changes in these ratios and a decrease in the absolute amounts of our sex hormones, we really have to turn an eye to what kind of external stress can we put on the body that's going to make the body respond the way the hormones used to support? So this is where we have to start unpacking a lot of the training, especially when we're talking about runners and ultra running and the long distance stuff. Because when we get there, if we take away our sex hormones and we look at basic sex differences, women's bodies are already very endurant. We have more oxidative fibers or those slow twitch fibers. We lose our fast twitch fibers really rapidly. We're already metabolically flexible. We're already really, really capable of having glycogen sparing and using free fatty acids. So when we start talking about long distance athletes, we need to really dial back on that volume because the body's not going to respond very well to that volume because it's already capable of doing that. And this is something that's really difficult for runners and long distance cyclists to get their head around, that you don't have to spend as much time doing the volume, because if you do, you're actually not going to adapt. It's a maladaptive response.
And when you say respond, you mean performance wise? You mean body composition wise? What do you mean by your as a yes
by response? So the acute exercise session itself is a stress, and our body responds to that stress by recovering. And what we want to do is recover to a point where we are fitter than we were going into that session. So when I say respond, it's responding to those acute exercise stressors. So over the course of time, we are fitter. And that's what we think about when we're periodizing our training to get ready for a half marathon or a marathon, is those acute little training stresses that the body's in, like, I better get stronger. So if I encounter that stress again, I can overcome it and not be as stressed.
Yeah, it was one thing I thought of when you were mentioning all that is, especially in like endurance running and ultra running, it's like the wave of like there's a lot of very fast, women in their late 30s, early 40s, and I have to imagine it attributes a lot to having actual research for women and scientific studies for women that exist now that 20 years ago were all based on men, and Joe, you just become 40 and you just lift a little more and your body's fine, but like that's not how this works at all in the women's body. And so having all this is like why it feels like there's just this amazing many women who are just achieving so much greatness and crushing records at in their 40s. It's just crazy to see.
Yeah, science and coaching are starting to actually catch up with each other, because usually it's like coaching's about 20 years behind the science. And now that we're having really good science and we're having a global conversation around how to train the female athlete in various life stages, that we're really seeing it rapidly acquire into that sports space. And we're seeing women who are achieving, not getting injured, and really hitting and breaking these records. I found the Olympics really interesting. I always find them interesting because you see the best biomechanical and body shape that's appropriate for each of the sports to be successful. And seeing how many golds were won by the female athletes in the US contingency, I was like, yeah, this is great, because it's feeding into those coaching programs. And I was coming home from Paris, and a guy came up to me in one of the airport lounges and goes, "Are you Dr. Stacy Sims?" I'm like, "Yeah." He goes, "Oh, I'm one of the physiologists and coaches for USA Cycling, and I just wanted to say thank you, because we've been working with our athletes based on all the stuff that's being put out and pushed from you, and we've had great success." I'm like, "Oh, I feel so good. This is awesome
fangirling.
To know that, yeah, we're really trying to push stuff into the right domains here." So
Yeah, and it has to take so much trust to like adapt training, right? Because like as you get faster, you want to keep it the same. Like, oh well, I'm 30, I did this type of training. Now I'm 35, I want to maybe increase the volume or increase the intensity. But like, it's really about how do you adapt not only to life stresses, like having children and all those jobs changes, but like your body that's vastly changing, and trust that okay, I could do a little less, or I could train differently, and I could get faster.
yeah, that's it. Because when we think about volume versus intensity, and a lot of people start upping the volume, but then they're too tired to do the right kind of intensity, so they don't get faster. So if we're like really looking and listening and seeing what the physiological differences are and how we can maximize the training stress for a woman's body versus a man's body, we start to see better improvements in what the women can do.
I think that's actually a good segue to something I was thinking about earlier. You're talking about getting the most bang for your buck with literally with less volume on the body. Let's talk for a second about lifting heavy weights. Um,
Yeah, for
so
sure.
so we were talking about getting stronger, right? Getting stronger as runners, and or maybe running isn't our sport of choice, right? Just engaging with lifting weights. What kind of workout gives a I guess we could start with perimenopausal women, but you can feel free to talk about earlier phases. What gives us the most bang for our buck when it comes to lifting weights?
When we're looking again at what's happening in perimenopause and the changes of our estrogen progesterone, we have to kind of take a step and say, well, if we look at estrogen, estrogen actually is the testosterone of women. It grows tissues, it is responsible for power and strength. So, specifically at the level of the basic muscle cell, estrogen is responsible for the feedback to grow those muscle cells under load. It's also responsible for how strong our contractile proteins bind together. And it's also responsible for how much of acetylcholine is available for a nerve conduction to cross over to polarize and create that muscle contraction. So it's responsible for how fast that contraction is, how strong that contraction is, and how much muscle is there to be contracted. So when we start losing estrogen, we have to, like I said before, look for an external stress. So if we're looking at the typical strength training programs that are out there, like using body weight or going 10 to 12 reps, 3 sets, it's more of a metabolic stress. It's not a strong enough stress to instigate these changes that we need to maintain speed and power and lean mass development. We need heavier loads. And I am now getting asked, well, what does heavy mean? So we have a cohort of women who are 40 plus who've never been introduced to what is lifting because of our culture of, cardio is king. And if you're going to do weights, then it's going to be the 5 pound pink dumbbells that you're doing barbell or dumbbell curls as you're doing your walk, right? And that is not lifting. That might be some resistance, but if you're running in a headwind, that's resistance too. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about it takes time to learn how to lift heavy. And we want it to be an eye for the rest of your life because we know resistance training, especially if we're doing a central nervous system and a nervous system response, which are heavy loads, it sets us up to be very strong and powerful for the back half of a race, which is where performance oriented people are looking. But from a long term view, we see that as you are really taxing the nervous system, you're creating better neural growth patterns in the brain. So you're able to attenuate cognitive decline. You're able to slow the rate of risk of Alzheimer's. You're better proprioception, better metabolism. And the stress on the bone reduces that risk for osteoporosis. And we see that women can lose up to 1/3 of their bone mass through the menopause transition because estrogen and progesterone are so tightly tied to bone architecture and bone turnover. So if we bring it back to resistance training for perimenopausal women, it's really important to lift heavy. So we go into the power-based training, where if we say 5 reps by 5 at 80%, what does that mean? That means if you come in and you're going to do a deadlift, if you can lift that deadlift weight 10 times, it's too light. You want to be able to lift it 5 times really well and maybe have 1 or 2 more reps with really good form. And then that's your load to start. And it changes on how you feel when you go into the gym. So I'm not one that's like, okay, we have to go 80% of 1 rep max because a lot of people can't do a 1 rep max. So we always go things like reps in reserve, which is what I just described. You go in, you put heavier weight on, and with really good form, you lift it and see how many more reps you could eke out after 5. If it's up to 10, too light. If it's 9 or 8, put a little bit more on. If it's 7, you're good to start.
You can't see this, Dr. Sims, but one of my clients made me this shirt. It says "Building Bad B Bones" because she knows
Ah, I love
this is
it.
this is my slogan with my clients, that we're building bad B bones, and I'm keeping myself reserved because you're present with us, but we use the B word with each other, and we're comfortable.
Okay. That's fine because I am notorious for potty
Oh.
mouth to the point where my husband thought my daughter's first word was going to be something that wasn't so pleasant in the general
Oh, okay.
environment.
Well, that's good to know. Well, then I would have fucked around and found out with you, Dr. Sims, but
Yeah, I know. I love it.
I
I love it.
love so let me this might sound strange, but for those of us who have explored HRT, hormone replacement therapy, how
Mhm.
does that play into is it as important for women who are on HRT to lift heavy as well?
So the conversation about hormone replacement therapy is that it's very similar to what you would expect in an oral contraceptive pill because it's estrogen and progesterone. But they are two very, very
Mm.
different things. If we're talking about birth control, the design of birth control is that the estrogen and progesterone components are at high enough dose to stop ovarian function and take over. When we're talking about hormone replacement therapy, we really kind of describe it as menopause hormone therapy because the goal of the estrogen progesterone is to give a low enough dose that we don't have a complete drop off the cliff. Because as we're going through perimenopause, we're also having a down regulation of our estrogen and our progesterone receptor sites. So we don't have the availability of trying to, quote, replace to our pre-menopausal levels. And it's not ideal to do that either. So when we're looking at using HRT, it is a tool in the toolbox to slow the rate of change. It doesn't mean that it's going to stop what is happening. You still have to put in the work in order to change body composition, get strong, maintain your bones. Because the whole idea of using MHT is again to attenuate or slow all of the symptomology that occurs with this overt ovarian wind down. It's not for brain health. It's not to reduce cardiovascular risk factors. It's not to prevent you from getting fat. It's to slow the rate of change. So yes, you have to put in the work too.
It's a great answer. Great answer.
You're
Yeah.
welcome. I don't think very like you hear all of the physicians on social media talking, but they're from the physician side of things. They're like, yeah, it helps with all of these things, but no one tells you. But actually, it doesn't really stop the serial fat gain. It doesn't stop body composition change. It just slows that rate. So even if you go on it, it doesn't mean that you're in the free and clear. You do have to make these changes, especially if you are an active and or competitive woman who wants to maintain her ability to do her sport and do it well.
Yeah. Makes sense here. So let's talk a little bit about what HIIT is training is and what it is not. Talk about sprint interval training, running fitness, like how many times per week, all these types of things, and when it comes to this world.
Yeah. Yeah. So high intensity interval training is like the umbrella term for all of our intervals. Within that, we have sprint interval training. But if we look at what true high intensity interval training is, it's still polarized training. So we can think about it as 800 reps on the track with adequate recovery in between because you want to be able to do each rep really well or negative split it. We can look at it as VO2 intervals like 3 minutes on, 3 minutes off, 2 minutes on, 4 minutes off. And the goal of it is to hit an intensity that's about 80 to 85% of your max and then have a recovery that's maybe 50% because it's for true high intensity interval training, it's more of a metabolic stress. And we're trying to raise our lactate threshold. We're trying to maybe improve the top end of our VO2 to improve our working capacity as a runner. But from a perimenopausal standpoint, it improves our insulin sensitivity. It also creates some additional conversations within the muscle itself to improve our mitochondrial function. So then when we move to sprint interval training is even harder than what our traditional VO2s are. So sprint interval training is 30 seconds or less, maximum intensity. So you're going 110%, you're going full gas as hard as you can go. And the recovery is really long. We're looking at 30 seconds on, 2 to 3 minutes off. because we're trying to get a full nervous system and metabolic recovery. So it's the ATP CP recovery as well as the central nervous system. And the reason for that is we need that stress to be super, super, super high, because we need to have an epigenetic change that's occurring within the muscle to, one, create more muscle fibers and create faster contractile strength, maintain our type 2 fibers, which tend to die off rather quickly. And then we also want to increase the amount of myokines or exerkines that are being produced. So these are metabolites that are coming from our skeletal muscles. It's being used. And it tells the body that we don't need visceral fat. We need to use the fatty acids that are circulating and put them into intramuscular storage so that we can have it available for when we're at rest. So it's really important when we're trying to downgrade that deep abdominal fat that we do the super high intensity work. And at the same time, when we're trying to increase our lean mass with resistance training, we also want that metabolic consideration of high intensity interval training so that our blood glucose is under control. Because women start to have more insulin resistance. And the way that we see that occurring is they start to get a little bit more fluffy. I have a lot of women who are like, I feel like I got fluffy overnight. What happened? And it's like, okay, well, now we really have to look and not have you in moderate intensity training, which is what a lot of HIIT classes and stuff tend to be. Or if you're going to go for a long run, making sure that your rating perceived exertion is between 1 and 3, not above that. Otherwise, you fall in moderate intensity. And that's kind of that gray zone where it's too easy to be hard to invoke any change, and it's too hard to be easy to allow your body to recover. So this is where we have to be very pointed in what we are specifically doing in a HIIT or a sit workout. You might have one HIIT and 1 or 2 true sit training sessions in a week, or you have 2 HIIT sessions. But you don't want to overdo it because it's so intense and your body wants to recover well from it. Plus, if you're doing strength training as well, then that's another higher stress on the body. Even though it's not a metabolic stress, it's still a central nervous system stress, and you need to recover well from that too.
Yeah, no, that's great. I really think people get hit wrong a lot, and how they think of it and what they think. And I definitely think people don't do enough sprint training. Very few, especially as you get old. I mean, when you're a kid, you sprint all the time everywhere and you're never tired. But, once you get older, people do not run max effort for short reps ever. They don't want to. It's not exciting to them. And, they miss out on an entire, portion of training to help you be better because they don't see the gains. They just want to run a marathon. So I'll just do 1 to 3 exertion every day, long runs. Maybe I'll do a little bit of speed, get to 5 or 6 because I don't want to hurt too much. And, I'll just sit there. It's comfy, it's cozy, and they enjoy the long runs because it's, a couple hours with friends maybe, but getting them just to sprint for 30 seconds and try and explain how that really, the faster you can sprint, the faster you can run every distance. That's hard sometimes for people to wrap their head around.
Yeah. And I always get the pushback of, but I love my long stuff. What am I going to do? I don't want to just do the short, hard stuff. I don't want people to give away their soul food because I understand the whole social aspect of being with friends and going out for a group run or a ride or whatever it is. You just don't make that the bread and butter. Just like you're talking about, Nick, everyone wants to go out for the comfortable stuff and not push their body too much. By the inherent nature of being human, we are lazy. We don't like to be uncomfortable. But in order to progress, we have to put ourselves in those uncomfortable positions. And people are often concerned about pulling a hamstring when they start doing sprint training. Well, you can do hill bounds, right? You can do a 3 to 4% grade and push really, really hard against that. And you're going to get that muscular response without the fear of pulling a hamstring. And I don't think people think about that either. It's just a hill bound. It's well, actually, we can make that into a sprint interval session.
Yeah, it's just harder.
It is harder. You feel like you're going so slow, but you're pushing so hard.
You were talking a little bit about recovery earlier, and I guess my question is, what makes women's recovery process post-exercise so different from men's? I've heard you also talk about taking a deload week. I believe that you've mentioned every 3 weeks. Can you talk a little bit more about how we recover and why it's so important that we adequately.
So women by the nature, again, if we take away our sex hormones, are more endurant. So it's really hard to do the high intensity stuff. So when I talk about taking a deload every third week, this is where we're working on our mobility. We're doing the really low intensity stuff that people like, because we need to maximally recover from all that top end stuff. If we're looking on a cycle of every 4 or 5 weeks, doing a deload is too much. And we start to see women are getting stressed, they're getting plantar fascia issues, a whole bunch of soft tissue injuries. And two of the most apparent injuries in perimenopause is frozen shoulder and plantar fascia, because we start to have a little bit of a tendon dysfunction with loading because we're losing estrogen. So we have to be very careful on how we're loading, and we're taking time away from that load. I think the other thing that people don't think about when they're talking about recovery, because there are so many, especially women, are like, I don't want to take a recovery week, I feel fine. But recovery is where your body fully engages in all the stress that has just occurred over the past couple of weeks, and you get fitter and stronger. And people are like, well, I don't want to take a deload week because I don't feel like I'm getting any benefit. Actually, you are. Like, if you take that deload week and then you go back and try to do your track session, you're going to be so much faster and recover better, because your body's like, sweet, I'm able to repair all these small little tears and all the little bits and pieces that I don't normally get to repair. And if you don't allow that recovery, then this is where we really start to see the soft tissue problems. And a lot of people are like, oh, I've got a stress fracture again. What's going on? It's like, well, we need to really take care of that recovery and that deload. So you have the acute right after exercise, but then you also have the more chronic recovery. If we talk about the acute recovery post-exercise, women tend to vasodilate first, and men tend to vasoconstrict first. So what I mean by that is, when women stop exercising, most of their blood goes to their hands and their feet. For men, it goes back to the heart. So right there is a difference in recovery. When we're talking about cold water immersion or post-exercise, cold exposure, it works for women, but not for men. Because if you're looking at putting your legs into a lake after a long run, yeah, that's going to work really well for women, because now all of a sudden they're having the cool gradient against the skin that's going to cause a vasoconstriction and send that blood back to the heart to then start circulating to get rid of excessive metabolic waste, where men have that inherently. So when we talk about also from the metabolic standpoint post-exercise, we see that women return to metabolic baseline within 90 minutes. So what I mean by that is your blood glucose comes back to being stable, your fat metabolism comes back to being at a resting point, whereas men, depending on intensity, that doesn't happen for 3 to 18 hours. So when we're talking about nutrition and pulling nutrition in for full recovery, women's window is smaller than what it is for men. So that's why I'm always pressing the protein, because if you're getting protein, you're getting amino acids. It's going to kickstart reparation. It's going to tell the hypothalamus that, yes, we have nutrition coming in, but it also opens that window to another 2 hours for women then to say, okay, now I'm ready for my full meal. And then that meal will actually go for recovery to our liver and our muscle and all the other aspects of repair that need to happen. So it's just those small little nuances when you start looking at that physiology that can make a huge difference to how a woman is responding to her training and recovering from it.
So interesting. I find it's really hard for most of my women athletes to do a deload or down week. Like, they really struggle because they just don't see the benefit from it. They're like, can we push one more week? Like, I do it every 3 weeks, and
Great.
and they're always pushing. No, I can go one more week, or I don't want to lose this role I'm on, or like I want to keep this going. And I'm like, well, that week of down is the week where we gain all the fitness, so then we can go back. Like, stress plus rest equals growth, and so like we need that rest, and like we have to build it in. So like it's usually non-negotiable for me, and I try and plan that really far in advance and let everyone know, like, we're gonna do this. It's okay. Like,
Great.
it's just going to be lighter, but like for some reason my male athletes are always like, yeah, I definitely need this down week this week. It's perfectly timed. I'm happy. I'll do it. But I always get so much more pushback from my female athletes on like this, just doing a down week.
Yeah, and that is a sociocultural thing, right? Because
Sure.
women have always been pushed that you have to keep going and going and going. And the cardio, if you miss 2 days of cardio, you're going to put fat on. And we know that's absolutely not true. So wrapped up in the subconscious of not wanting to do a deload is this inherent cultural fear that they're going to go backwards instead of forward. So we're really working hard to unpack that and say, you know what, when you're recovering, you're increasing your anti-inflammatory responses, you're increasing your antioxidative responses, which means you have better cellular integrity, which means you're going to be able to go faster. So it's hard. Sometimes I start with a 5-day deload instead of a 7-day deload. And then I'll preface it as like, we're going to have a 5K test before and after. And then people are kind of like, oh my gosh, I went so much faster after that 5-day deload. Yeah, that's it. Because you had all this stress and you tried to run a 5K, and then you have the time where your body's fully recovering and repairing. It's not like you're doing nothing, you're doing active recovery and mobility. Then you go run that 5K and like, whoa, that's crazy. So it's kind of proof in the pudding, which I'm sure that you guys do, but sometimes you just need a little extra
No,
nudge for
that's
those
the
people who are like,
hack.
I don't want
That's
to do
the
it.
that's the pro. Coaches, take notes. Take notes. I love that. That's a
Yeah.
great idea. So I think we were talking a little bit about uh, we're all the data that we have right now on, or a lot of the data is on zone two training are based on men. And as we were chatting about earlier, we have a ton of runners who listen to this podcast, and the majority of our listenership, and as well as mine and Nick's clients, are and our followers are both majority women. So, what are outside of what are your thoughts on zone two training outside of body composition? You've kind of already touched on it. Is there anything else that you would add to why it's so important to truly put your ego aside and be in that one, ego aside amongst other things, 1 to 3 rate of perceived exertion for our runners?
So I joke with some of my other colleagues about zone two. We're like, if you're a professional athlete, you have all the time in the world and you don't have to work, sure, put in some zone two. Sweet, that's fine. But because we're all so busy, we want to, again, maximize bang for a buck. When we look at zone two, all the data, again, is based on male physiology. And by the nature of being XY, men need to work on mitochondria and mitochondria function, mitochondria respiration. Women, we don't. We're already like, we have more of the proteins in the mitochondria that allow us to have very efficient, flexible mitochondria where it has its inherent metabolic flexibility. So switching between carb and fat. What we need to do is that polarized stuff so we can produce more lactate. And then for the recovery, the whole idea of recovery is just to keep the blood moving and circulating, but not to create a metabolic stress, or more importantly, a sympathetic nervous system stress. So when we're talking about ultimate recovery, when we get to perimenopause, it's really, really difficult for women to get out of that tired but wired state. And the reason for that is the undercurrent of stress that's happening as your body's perceiving the change in the ratios of estrogen and progesterone. We also have an inherent rise in our baseline cortisol. So if we're continuously stressing that baseline cortisol, that baseline becomes the new norm. We want to think about it as, your resting heart rate. As you get fitter, your resting heart rate drops. As you start polarizing your training and you start doing that zone 1, RP 1 to 3 as your recovery, you start to see baseline cortisol drop, and you get better parasympathetic activation, which means that you can get into really good sleep. And sleep is fleeting. So anything that we can do to maximize our ability to get into a parasympathetic state, to have really good sleep and sleep recovery, the better it is. So when we start pulling it all apart, it's like the polarization that we see for training for women is important, not only for everything that she's going through as perimenopause into postmenopause. Yes, postmenopausal women should be doing the same thing. And we see it's really important for brain function with regards to changing of our autonomic nervous system. So we don't want to walk around tired but wired all the time, because that's just ineffective to be happy in life. So when we're doing that really low intensity, yes, it's full recovery for the training we're doing, but it's even better recovery for our nervous system.
We love sleep and we love to be recovered.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, we do. And zone two is all the rage. It's like, the
I
thing you
know.
hear the most on social media from runners. It's, how can I be
Well,
100% zone two all the time on my runs? And like,
uh,
it took off too much, I feel like. And, absent is all the other stuff that make periodic training. It's
yeah.
just, oh, well, zone two is this hot button and people are making social media content about it. So I'll just do that.
Yeah. And it's two of the male influencers that pushed it so much. I
Yeah.
won't necessarily mention their names, but I can see by your faces
It's
who
okay.
I mean.
And Dr. Sims, this is a safe space for naming names, not for them, but for us. So
Okay. So yeah, I get frustrated when Atia and Huberman push something out and they don't take regard to who the listeners are and how that's going to be perceived outside of the male active biohacker. And yes, zone two is good for people who are just coming off the couch and don't move at all. But when we start looking at the active population, which we are right now talking about, there just isn't the place to put a huge precedence on it, regardless. Well, more so for women, but even for men who are really seriously busy and trying to increase their performance. That's why we joke about if you were a professional athlete and had
right,
all the time in the world, then
right.
sure,
Yeah.
put in your 45 to 90 minutes of zone
It's
two every
quite a
other day.
privilege. Quite a privilege. Well, I hope that
Yes.
when Huberman was lucky enough to have you on, he was educated. As we say, you go and learn
We have
today.
a, that's right. Yeah, that was a fun situation to be in because
Situation is a
different,
choice
because I'm
word. It's
originally from, yeah, I know. I'm originally from San Francisco, so you have all these commonalities with other people who are in the room. So it was, yeah, it was fun. Yeah.
But it's good when conversations can happen where people can because like a lot of what you're saying, especially about like what men need, for to are all the things I heard my whole life. Like, oh, here's mitochondria buildup and this and so like I lived that life of like male research. So here's how I'm going to train, and then you become a coach, and you get a lot more female athletes, and you learn like, oh, like I year after year I've learned more and more about like I can't train anyway. Like I am like, everything is so different. The women's body is so different, but like very little education on my part growing up of like the female body and everything. So as a coach, it requires you to take those extra steps and learn instead of just taking your own, observed journey and just making that the way you train. Like how so many people push their training today is, oh, it worked for me, so I'm going to train everyone the way I train. It's like, no, you can't do that at all.
No. And unfortunately, at the university level in the exercise physiology classes, they're still using the typical textbooks. And I say this because in all my various travels recently, I'm on the train flat platform and I hear this young girl talking about her ex-phys class and how she's so excited and that they're learning Douglas bags and VO2. And then me being me, I'm like, so are they telling you the differences between men and women? And she's like, what do you mean? What differences? And I was like, oh gosh. She's like, what year are you? She's like, I'm a sophomore. I was like, okay, well, yeah, we have to have a talk here because it's still not being highlighted in the basic undergrad, which is where people are starting their careers as coaches and PTs and all the other stuff. So yeah, still have work to do there.
Let's talk fueling needs and supplements like creatine. Should perimenopausal women and menopausal women be prioritizing these?
Yes, there are three big ones. I won't say protein as well. I'll say protein is the fourth one with regard to supplementation, because protein has been out of the nutrition conversation for so long because we've just been focusing on fat and carbohydrate, right? But protein is so important. And one thing I like to remind people is that when we look at the recommended daily allowance of protein, which now, states that women need between 50 and 55 grams a day, that's the bare minimum to prevent malnutrition. It is not the bare minimum that you need for functionality. So when we start looking at active research, we see that women who are recreationally active need 1.6 grams per kilo. So that's about that zero point 0.8 to 1 gram per pound. And that's to be able to not become malnourished and to progress and repair and have good functionality. So this is where protein supplementation can come in handy when you're looking at getting 120 to 150 grams per day. You're not that hungry. It's okay to use a protein powder. Just make sure that's not your only protein source. So that's my stitch on the whole protein side. We look at the three main ones that we want women to have. We see creatine monohydrate, omega-3 fatty acids, and vitamin D3, especially in perimenopause. So with creatine monohydrate, we're not talking about the bodybuilding scope. We're looking at creatine for health. And there's a really good website called Creatine for Health that has the latest studies and all the peer-reviewed journals in there that they talk anywhere from pregnancy through perimenopause to postmenopause, cancer, all sorts of things when we're talking about the health aspect. But when we bring it back to perimenopause, because women have 70 to 80% of the stores of creatine that men have, and yes, we do produce some naturally from the liver every day, we start supplementing with maybe 3 grams a day. Not only do we get better muscle saturation, so we have better muscle performance, but it also helps with things like our gut distress. And we see there's a 5-to-1 ratio of women to men having gut distress, especially when they're running. So if we're increasing our creatine and we're saturating our intestinal lining, then we're able to hold that mucosal lining together for a longer period of time. And then it stops things like, oh, I have to stop 2 miles into my run and find a bathroom. Because now we have the availability of maintaining that mucosal lining. We also see it's really important for brain health and mood. So when we talk about creatine monohydrate, I feel like it's a non-negotiable, especially when we're talking about active women and wanting to age well. When we're in perimenopause, we want to increase our omega-3s, either through supplementation or making sure that we're having really good wild-caught fatty fish, because estrogen is responsible for anti-inflammatory responses and antioxidative responses at the cellular level. So when we start to lose estradiol, we need those omega-3s to kind of come in and help maintain cellular integrity. So it's important. It's really important. And then vitamin D3, because there's so much research out there about how every system of the body is affected by vitamin D. But for perimenopausal women in particular, the risk of low ferritin and iron deficiency increases, because some women will have really heavy bleeds plus inflammation, and those two really deplete iron stores. Then if you're a runner, you also have a higher risk of lower iron stores. Vitamin D3 helps counter some of the inflammatory properties so that your body can absorb iron really well. So those are the 3 really big ones that I really push in the perimenopausal set. Everything else is kind of independent. But then when we look at our ergogenic aids, and I bring up things like beet juice and nitrates, really not beneficial for women who are either pre or perimenopausal. When you have estrogen circulating, nitrates can actually dampen your performance, because estrogen is so tightly tied to the way that our blood vessels respond to dilation and constriction. Postmenopausal women who have temperature issues and can't tolerate the heat very well and are having blood pressure issues, nitrates are beautiful because it takes the place of what estrogen used to do within the blood vessels. Premenopause, perimenopause, stay away from it, because it does the opposite of what you think it does. It doesn't increase vasodilation. It causes a disconnect and a confusion, drops your VO2 max, and drops your exercise capacity.
Very interesting as it relates to heat. I am personally a plant in the heat. I have no problem being in the heat. Very, very well acclimated. You do? Yeah, yeah.
I love it.
Yeah. So, but that is
Absolutely.
very interesting.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
I have a friend who's just recently transitioned into being fully postmenopausal and still has lots of heat issues. So I got her some beet juice. I'm like, try this before. And she's like, oh my God, I can actually do stuff now in the heat. I was like, yes, it's great.
It's
Meanwhile, I'm just melting away in the heat.
Nick, the problem. So what Nick hasn't shared with you, Dr. Sims, is that Nick already has the Halloween situation situated outside of his home. I know.
What?
As soon as I can. It's like August 10th, and I'm like getting down to decorations. I need fall to come quicker, autumn to come quicker than I could
Summer
possibly imagine. I just
forever
need.
up in here. Summer
I need
forever
summer
up in
forever.
here.
Yeah, I'm with you. Nick, you need to live in a cold country. I
Oh,
recommend New Zealand. New
Yeah.
Zealand by itself is a cold country. They
I've
all
always
have
been
the,
East. Yeah.
yeah, East Coast weather. Whoa, the
Yeah.
humidity gets to me. But up to Saturday, I'd been in the East Coast and Paris in Hawaii. So I've been really adapted to the really high
Yeah.
heat. Although I have a tank top on, I'm freezing. But that's because the room is heated, but it's winter out there. I'm like, where's my 80, 90, 100 degrees?
it's
Because
my
I don't
sweet
like the
spot.
cold.
I'm with you on
Yeah.
that. I'm with you.
Yeah. Yeah.
I will complain in the winter though that it's cold, so I'm not the
We
greatest
won't
source
tolerate
here.
it.
I'm whining both times. Yeah.
We won't tolerate the
Mm,
complaints, Nick. We will not.
no.
I think you were talking a little bit about fueling. Actually, we haven't touched yet upon fueling in and around the training. So I would love to hear more about your thoughts on going into. I already know your thoughts, but I just love to hear you talk about the importance of fueling before we exercise, during our exercise, depending on the sport and depending on the training, and I guess the impacts of long term low energy availability in the women's body.
Um, so when we talk about pre-fueling, a lot of people don't like to eat before they go out, especially for a run. Often first thing in the morning, they're like, I don't want to have anything. But for women in particular, we have to think about pre-fueling. And I don't mean a full meal. I mean, maybe 30 grams of carb and 15 grams of protein before you go. So it's not a lot. And the reason for that is you need to bring your blood sugar up because women's bodies, again, fuel differently than men's. We go through blood sugar and then we get into free fatty acid use. We spare our liver and our muscle glycogen a lot easier than men do. So if we try to start a workout and we haven't brought in anything, our cortisol is already elevated and we're fighting the system to fuel well. If you want to do any kind of intensity, you're not going to hit those intensity metrics. The other thing that going out and exercising fasted or without any kind of fuel is that your hypothalamus is now going, hey, wait a second, here's this exercise stress and I don't have any fuel coming in, so I'm going to have to provide it. Over the course of 4 days of that, we start to see thyroid dysfunction. Thyroid starts to get turned down a bit. We also have a greater impetus for losing lean mass because the very first thing that goes when we exercise fasted is lean mass because it's a metabolically active tissue and it's energy hungry. And the body's like, I need to get rid of this and start storing fat. So women, by the nature of how we've all grown up about fat burning, still have this idea that they need to do their workouts fasted to burn fat. But in actuality, if you aren't fueling, you're feeding the storage of fat. You're not promoting fat loss. The other thing about eating during exercise is if you are going out for a training session that's more than about 75 minutes, then you need to replace some of your blood sugar. And it's not the 90 to 120 grams of carbohydrate per hour. I like to remind people that that study was done on 13 elite male triathletes. When we look at the data that comes out, and we see things that women have a slower gastric emptying rate, so that amount of carbohydrate will just sit in the gut and cause a lot of gut dysfunction. We know from some CGM studies and some recent studies that women can use 30 to 40 grams the most. And that's just, a small amount of carbohydrate to keep that blood sugar up. And if you're doing that, then post-exercise, the one goal is to shut down catabolism or shut down your breakdown state, bring cortisol down, and tell the hypothalamus that, yes, there's some fuel coming in so that you don't have to downturn the thyroid. So if we're doing it appropriately and we're having a small amount of food before we go out training, if we're going for a longer training session, we're supporting that with a little bit of carbohydrate. Then we come home and have breakfast. That's sweet. Then your body's in a good rhythm It's working with our circadian rhythm. It's working with the hypothalamus. You're going to be able to work to get fitter and change body composition. What we see when women withhold food or they do intermittent fasting and they don't eat until like noon, or they delay their food intake after their training, is we get a misstep in our circadian rhythm. And all of our cells have their own circadian rhythm as well as a total body circadian rhythm. So we start to see a misstep in all of our endocrine function. All of our hormones work on a pulse, and they're controlled by daylight, nighttime, and food intake. So if you're exercising on an empty stomach and then you're coming home and you're withholding food because you're like, I'm too busy, I'm not hungry, you're resetting your circadian rhythm. So it feeds back to, let's store fat. Let's increase our sympathetic drive. Let's store fat. The simplest thing is to have that little bit of carbohydrate and protein before and breakfast after. And then that allows our body to do what it needs to do to train well, recover, but most importantly, keep us out of the perception of low energy availability. So with low energy availability, if we are perpetually in this low energy state, the repercussions are getting into full relative energy deficiency in sport. And this is where every system of the body is affected. And we start to see a dysfunction in every system, where we have endocrine dysfunction, we have cardiovascular dysfunction, meaning we have heart palpitations, increased risk factors for cardiovascular events. We have mood disorders, we have gut dysfunction, we lose bone, we lose skeletal mass. So it's just a whole body kind of shut down. And I don't think a lot of women understand, and even men, because we see low energy availability in men as well, what that means. Because I'll have people say, oh, I try to stay between 16 and 1800 calories a day. I'm like, well, wait a second. Is that when you're not training, or what are you doing? Especially when we're looking at perimenopausal women who, by the nature of all the changes, are starting to see increased body fat. So unfortunately, the mental shift in there hasn't occurred that we need to eat more and change our training. It's, I need to train more and eat less. So then it perpetuates low energy availability. So if we're looking at someone who's just sitting on the couch all day, who is average height and might be 20% or 22% body fat, then we're looking at a minimum need of 1800 calories just to exist. As soon as you get up and start moving around, you need more. As soon as you start adding training, you need even more. So when I tell someone who says, I'm trying to stay between 1600 and 1800 calories a day, that they actually need about 27 to 2800 calories, they're like, what? What do you mean? No, I'm going to get fat. It's like, nope, you won't. We're going to slowly increase the amount you're eating over the course of 2 months. And you're going to go from eating 1600 to 2600. And in that course of time, you're going to see body composition change for better. You're going to have better sleep, better recovery, because then your body's not fighting itself to fuel itself. It's finally like, yes, now I have the energy I need to maintain normal function, and I have the fuel available to repair and adapt and recover so that we can get fitter.
Very interesting. And I think it's unfortunately what happens is we learn lessons, unfortunately, the hard way. And
Yep.
what you just shared is you're giving folks the opportunity to not have to learn. Because
We've done all the
yes,
mistakes.
Yeah.
That's why we want people to understand them so
we
they don't
sure
go through
have.
them.
We sure have. And you
Yeah.
can't build bad bitch bones if you're not eating enough.
Right. You can't build anything without eating enough.
A house of cards you can build that will eventually collapse. But
That's
it's
true.
like, and it's like, it's so hard. And sometimes I just try and convince people, like, if it's time, always in the morning, it's time. They're rushing out. They got to get home before their kids get to work. And it's like, well, then if you have 5 miles, do 3.5. And now you have 10 minutes to eat. And, or, like, so, oh, well, no, that's not enough. So it's like just helping them understand, well, you have to eat.
Right.
So we're
Yep.
going to do less.
Yep.
Like, if that's all you have time for. Otherwise, we're not going to do the round in the morning.
Yep. And be prepared. Put stuff in the fridge the night
Yes.
before. Yeah. So you can grab and go.
Yes. I love that. So, Dr. Sims, we actually would love to ask you, as one of our guests, we ask all of our guests 3 questions. They are as rapid of fire as you want to bring the speed to.
Okay. All right. Anticipate. Okay, let's go.
All right. Then we're question the 1. What's the best piece of advice you've ever received?
In what regards? Anything?
Anything. Yeah.
Oh, okay. To keep pushing. Keep asking questions and keep pushing. Because if you get some kind of negative answer or some kind of pushback, you know you're on the right track. Because you've, changed the dogma or thought process.
I like that.
Love that. I love pushing back. And, when you hit a brick wall, you're going the right direction. So that's great. What's one thing that people are generally surprised to find out about you?
Actually, an introvert.
Same.
Yeah. It takes a lot of energy. So I guess I'm a extroverted introvert or something to that effect where, I can do that. But then afterwards, I need to go hide.
Got to recharge the battery.
Yeah.
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 No, I feel the same way. I hide at parties half the time because
Yeah.
They're like, talk to people. I'm like, I already did. I'm done.
The 3 of us should go somewhere, but then
Yeah. We each take a corner of the bar.
There you go. That's an idea.
Last question. What's something you wish more people understood about your industry?
Mass confusion, and that there's the cross-pollination of clinical health and performance. And we need to untie that so that when you start hearing advice or looking, you have to specifically look at the population on which the research was done.
Sounds like a lot for people to understand who are already confused, Dr. Sims.
I know. That's why we're working to undo the confusion, but popular media doesn't help. So, yeah.
It doesn't allow for nuance. It's just quick bites of information that confuse people more.
Yep. Clickbait. Yep, that's it.
Well, Dr. Sims, we will not keep you. And we just, we would if we could, but we can't because it's almost midnight here on the East Coast. Okay. No. No, I'm just kidding. It's only 8:30 p.m., which is this introvert's.
That's
for
midnight.
me. It's midnight. Yeah. For folks listening who want to find you, what are the best ways to find you and to learn from you? Give us some of your media of choice.
So social media, we post quick hits of information and try to be as unbiased as possible because I want people to understand I don't have an agenda other than to educate. So Instagram, and if you're still on Facebook as well, Dr. Stacy Sims. And then to see all the stuff, the Dr. Stacy Sims webpage, because then you can see the seminars, the books, the courses, all the stuff that's going on in our world on that page.
Yes, we love that. Well, Dr. Sims, thank you so much for coming on Between Two Coaches.
Thanks for having me.
Can't put words to how it feels to have you on our podcast. So I won't. I'll take a step back and thank everyone now for listening and for joining us tonight or today, depending on when you listened. We hope you enjoyed this episode. And as always, you could reach out to us at any time on our individual Instagram pages, mine and Nick's, or at betweentwocoaches@gmail.com. And we will see everyone next time. Thank you.
Bye.